This is going to be the quarterly update video for winter 2019, and this is for Collective Narrative, part of the Collective Experiences SIG. I'm Sanfeng, and I'm joined by Gabriel, who's been added to this project this quarter. So we're just going to jump right into it with our research question, and it's essentially, how can an opportunistic, context-aware platform provide stories that are innovative and engaging? And this is more or less a kind of a build-up of the current existing collective experiences platform, which provides small singular OCE experiences that are fun in small bites, but don't really provide anything lasting or long-term. And so we're trying to see how can we add to this to make something that lasts for longer than a single experience. So we started the quarter off with some basic problem finding as well as user finding. And what we tried to do was we reached out to other user bases of storytelling, such as people who played D&D, people who did LARPing, as well as people who also engaged in collaborative storytelling methods, such as writing fan fiction in fandoms. And we quickly ran into roadblocks because we realized that many of these people who were using things like LARPing or D&D were perfectly happy with their storytelling method, and that they weren't really having any user problems. And so we instead pivoted to this more tech exploratory approach in which we tried to think of ways that the OCE medium could beyond innovate with by providing a different medium for storytelling. And so we identified one core outcome that we wanted to reach, which was idle users looking to kill time are able to have fun in a fictional story that allows them to incorporate their own personalities and environments into a character role in the story. Through this, they are also able to learn more about the environments and personalities of the other people they interact with.
So, moving on to obstacles, there are several different classes of obstacles that have to do with achieving this outcome, both with existing approaches and with how we are thinking about CN. So, the first big issue is, how do you get a group of people to create a story together? This relies very much on the interface and the system to emphasize storytelling and afford narrative elements, and most existing solutions simply don't do this. If you think about what, say, a group message chat affords, it's not really storytelling, but rather just communication. Second, how do you make that story fun for all users? So this really has to do with our focus on the fun and engaging outcome. This is a question of, how do we balance the user's freedom with the constraints of maintaining a story, and how do we make sure that the story itself is what is creating the fun aspects for our users? Third, how do you make the story opportunistic and context aware? So this is a very important set of obstacles for us, yet not necessarily the focus of our research, because this has more to do with collective experience itself, which is already, of course, an existing platform that we're building off of. And then you can ask the question, why not Niantic games such as Pokemon Go? Why don't they satisfy these obstacles? And mainly it's because they don't have much to do at all with story and with narrative. They're focused on this location-based gameplay, but not necessarily building out a story from beginning to climactic end. LARPing has sort of the opposite issue. It is built on story, but it misses out on the opportunistic and sort of remote aspects that we can afford.
As these obstacles, we identified three core characteristics. And so the first two, which is that the system has to be opportunistic and location-based and context-aware, are kind of carried over from the existing OCE platform design, which is kind of a result of us building this medium on that platform. The third one, and the main one that we want to talk about, is the idea of having a story to scaffold users' experiences. And this idea is essentially formatting and building our experiences in such a way that it follows the route of traditional stories. And so it starts off with a simple premise. Users are given goals for what they want to do. The story progresses in such a way that there's rising action and finally ends with a climax. And so our aim here is to essentially designate users with certain roles, give them goals for what they want to reach, and finally give them possibilities to reach that goal. And so to kind of go into a bit more detail, we're going to talk about our interface and system with an example. And so like we mentioned earlier, we want to have our user base as people in idle situations. So for example, people commuting or waiting in line for coffee. And so this is done simply by using the OCE platform engine, where we can detect what types of locations people are in at the time. So things like coffee shops, train stations, and etc. Now, moving on, we have a more detailed example of a CN story, which we call Murder in Coffee Town. And, and what this is essentially designating users with roles. And in this example, there's two types. There's people who are innocent, and there's the actual murder of a victim. And so in this case, the people who are innocent are clearly given a goal, which is to find the murderer as well as ways to find that. So they talk to each other, they can provide evidence. And on the other hand, the murderer has a goal, which is to escape the experience without being identified. And their possible actions are things like throwing people off their trail, providing false evidence, etc.
So the next important part of the interface is how it guides users through the story by continuing the scaffolding with hints. So an initial hint starts off the story. For example, in this scenario, it could be a hint about how crowded the coffee shops are, and it could say that the murderer is in a very crowded coffee shop. The participants can then try to prove their innocence by taking pictures, videos, audio recordings, and sending messages that captures how their coffee shop is not very crowded. The murderer, on the other hand, will have to send pictures and messages that try to deceive participants into thinking their coffee shop is also not very busy. So the system figures out which hints to send based on these attributes of the people's coffee shops. So for example, it can know that the murderer's coffee shop is the busy one and sends out messages based on that. Additional hints will prompt users when necessary. So the system will sort of monitor how many messages are being sent and find lulls in the conversation to decide when to send additional hints and how those hints should be formatted based on the context of the previous ones. There are also contextual hints that aren't necessarily about where the participants are, but rather about how they're acting. So for example, it could say user X is suspiciously quiet right now to sort of prompt the other users to think, if this person hasn't been talking, maybe they're maybe they're the murderer. Additionally, if one of the participants leaves the story before it is finished, the story will end without being able to find the murderer. This is just to take into account if others in their limited idle time won't be able to finish. And lastly, a climactic end is decided by when participants vote on who the murderer is. So they will have one chance to lock in their votes to see if they caught the murderer. And this is sort of what will lead up to the climax as participants start to point fingers and figure out who it would be. The system, on the other hand, will tally these votes and figure out who that murderer is.
For our interface and system, we designed an initial user study to see if our identified outcomes were actually being reached by users. And so in terms of measures, we identified three broad categories to see what we wanted to learn. So the first one is essentially learning. So in terms of users, how much did they learn about the other environments of the other users within the story, and how likely were they to visit based on what they learned? Second is very simple. It's did they have fun? So first of all, I wanted to know what users would be doing during their idle time if it weren't for the story, and did they think that this story was a better use of their idle time than that other activity? And third of all is the social aspect, the social component. So whether how interested users were in interacting with these other people, again in another story or at a different time and date. We had a few issues with this third category, simply because our user subjects were mostly friends who all knew each other, and they were not strangers. And so this is something that we need to consider for further user tests.
So we ran this user study twice with 3 participants participating in a collective narrative each time. And we had some findings. So first of all, users found certain prompts or certain hints that we gave them awkward, especially when they related to the demographics of their environment. So for example, we had a hint that had to do with how many older people were in the coffee shop that the murderer was in. And these were very awkward for participants to have to take photos of actual people, and that was difficult for them. So it helped us realize that the hints that we give really do matter. And in our second study, we pivoted a little bit and focused more on menu items and things that weren't necessarily people. And the ordering of the hints also matters. And we thought that sort of making sure that each hint leads successively to a more cohesive storyline would help. The other thing we realized is there really weren't any learning outcomes from participating in our collective narrative. So we kind of pivoted solely to our having fun outcome after realizing this, and the emphasis on learning, which we suspected would become less important, we kind of showed with our results. People didn't actually take into consideration the coffee shops people were in and didn't think, hey, I want to go visit that coffee shop down the line. Lastly, the pre-story experience really matters. So we realized to ask the right questions and give the right hints, we had to prompt the users for information about their coffee shops before the story even started. So we did this by asking them about, hey, how crowded is it right now? Can you send us some photos? And we realized we really needed to integrate that part of the process into our interface and system models. So since we took the tech exploratory approach, we do want to talk about the generalizability, our dotted lines of the T. So we have this sort of detailed interface and system model for murder mystery, but how can those same common characteristics work for other much different stories? So we have an example here of working collaboratively rather than competitively. So a murder mystery is inherently competitive, but the same format, or the same story characteristics can be used for a different story that involves collaboration. So for example, think about a group of participants trying to build a spaceship together to escape a dangerous planet. The same characteristics of getting successive hints that help them decide what they need to build and having them take pictures and take recordings to sort of capture the items that they have at their disposal to build and repair that spaceship are using those same common characteristics, but for a completely different story purpose. You can also think of connecting these experiences together into an experience, into a story that involves exploring a city. So participants sort of going beyond a single location type, such as a coffee shop, and involving a network of different location types in their story. So we think that some of these interface and system model characteristics would work for other stories. So takeaways and next steps. From our user testing, we also realized that the author's perspective is quite important. Defining the hints that are used is still an open question, and while the common language that we want to design for CN to encourage diverse stories has always been on the back of our minds, it has not been the focus of our research this quarter. So for next quarter, we definitely want to focus more on what that common language will look like, how it will connect stories together, and how the author's role will matter. The system is also really important, and we think building tech will be our best way to really further explore that system model, because currently Sanfeng and I have sort of had to use the Wizard of Oz approach and pretending to be the system, but to really explore how hints can be generated, hints can be ordered well, and the timing of those hints in a story can be given at good times. We think building out how that would look will help us. And lastly, that tech will also help us continue to do user testing, and especially figuring out how our story elements can generalize beyond simply a murder mystery into the other ideas that we have for what a collective narrative could look like. Thanks.